Good morning, Bitcoiners. This is Daniel from the Bitcoin Citadel. Citadel Summer episode number 61 today. And the subject of today's musings or rant, whatever you want to call it, right? Today's show is, the title I should say, is What a Fool Believes. And I don't know where this one's going to go today. Let me tell you how I came up with this. Yesterday's show was about your elevator pitch for people who are interested in Bitcoin. And you can watch that one if you want to get the details. But one of the things was I started to think about Nolan Bowerly's book about A Bitcoiner's Guide to NPC Management. And it's really based on archetypes, right? And that got me to thinking along those lines. That started my head on that. And then, I don't know if you guys look at Bitcoin Twitter much, Bitcoin X, but I like Max Keiser's, his Twitter feed. And yesterday he was getting obsessed with the moon landing, and he's pissed off at Gen X and Gen X and later, right? Millennials, because they don't believe in the moon landing. They think it's bullshit, right? And Max is a proud boomer, right? And the moon landing is very, very near and dear to boomers. I'm a boomer. I'm almost Max's age. He's a little bit older than me, right? And when I was a kid, the moon landing was everything. You don't know how important it was to us. We stopped classes at school to park our little butts there in the gym. And so they rolled the TVs. We used to have TVs that were on these rolling carts, right? Big, tall rolling carts. And TVs weren't that big in those days. To get a big TV, that was something, back in 1969, man. Not like today. So these big, huge TVs, you never saw one that big, right? You didn't have one like that in your house, right? They rolled it out into the gym, and all the little kids are sitting there. I was in elementary school then, right? We're all sitting there watching the moon landing. It was awesome, right? I remember when I was, I was like, in elementary school, then into, junior high, they still had moon landings and stuff like that. And NASA had all these cool pictures. You could order a book from NASA if you were a kid like me, and they'd send you this. It was like the best magazine ever, like the thickest, most, coolest paper, with these beautiful high-res photos. It was something else. It was the biggest marketing campaign ever, We loved it. So near and dear to us. So I can see why, as a boomer, he's really tied into that, right? But I think it's funny, though, because Max is the guy who's right about Bitcoin, He's the guy who actually was the first one who didn't trust, the financial system. And he talks about the separation of money and state and the end of the nation state. And I agree with him about all those things. But it's funny that this guy, Max Keiser, who I really think of, he's funny, and I keep saying funny now. Max Keiser. You know what Keiser means? Keiser is the same as Caesar. Keiser is like the king. Max Keiser says that Michael Saylor calls him the Pope of Bitcoin. But really, what I think of Max as is the jester of Bitcoin, the jester who is the guy who can speak freely to the king and be sarcastic and be funny and say the things that no one else can say. And if you look back at Max's career on Russia Today and Al Jazeera, he was always the guy who was poking the bear, right? He was always the guy who was saying, calling bullshit on things, right? And he was, already aware of the lie that was baked into the financial system and into the political system. He was one of these guys. He was like a punk, like a jester, right? all the way back then. And Max was right about Bitcoin from 2011. And that's why I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the richest men in the world when Bitcoin comes to term in 5 or 10 years. He's already doing real well, right? Financially. So Max, that's the guy he is. But he's a boomer too, and he's proud of he hasn't let go of some of the things that boomers hold very dear. So I'm thinking about Max, thinking about how he is the jester of Bitcoin. I wouldn't say he's the Pope of Bitcoin, like Saylor says. I think he's like a jester. Look at the way he dresses. He doesn't dress in motley. He doesn't have 3 bells on his head, but he dresses very colorfully, right? It's like a modern kind of motley that Max wears, you know? So that to me is the archetype of Max, is the jester. So let's put a pin in that for a second. And another name for a jester is a fool. So Max, in many ways, represents the fool. That's the archetype that Max has. Let's talk about another boomer who you guys might not know about as much as Max because he passed away, right? But this guy's name is Dave McGowan. And I don't know if you guys know about Dave. The way I ran into Dave is he wrote a great book that's called Weird Scenes Inside the Valley. And it's about Laurel Canyon in the 60s and the music scene that developed there. And it was really an important music scene. That's really where the hippie was invented, was in Laurel Canyon. Frank Zappa, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, all of these bands that really formed this California hippie mythos. That whole idea started in Laurel Canyon, and people from all over the world came to Laurel Canyon. Well, Dave's book is about the dark history of Laurel Canyon, and it's really very, very telling and interesting. Did you know that at the top of Laurel Canyon, there's a film and music production facility that's run by the military, right? Did you know that Jim Morrison, I almost called him James Morrison. Why would I say that? Jim Morrison, who really represents in some ways the archetype of that whole period, right? This guy who came out of nowhere, this poet who didn't even know how to play music. He'd never written a song before in his life. And he's born from, he comes fully formed into Laurel Canyon. And the Doors make their first album. None of them knew what they were doing. None of them were musicians. And yet here they were with this beautiful, perfect album. Jim Morrison's dad was an admiral in the Navy, right? He was the guy who was the boots on the ground, so to speak. I know he's in the Navy, right? But he was the guy who executed the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So really, he sparked the Vietnam War. Dave's book is all about the intelligence community connections to the music scene of the 60s, right? And I know, and it's very well documented, and it makes a ton of sense. The whole thing was a psyop, The whole LSD thing was a psyop. Read Storming Heaven, Boomers can't deal with that though, because that's their ground zero. That's where their ethos and their whole thing stems from. Feminism, psyop, Gloria Steinem. Max, moon landing. Dave McGowan wrote about the moon landing. He documented the moon landing. And there's super good evidence that it was a psyop, right? Dave McGowan also wrote about the Kennedy assassination and about the ties to Lincoln, right? He wrote about 9/11. He said he was the first 9/11 skeptic, and his process was using, photographic evidence and using documentary evidence and just making sense of things. Like, he's an investigative reporter. He's like a gumshoe, you know what I mean? And he used logic and first principles thinking to get to the bottom of these things, like a detective would, right? And if you read his work, it's a very compelling case about what 9/11 was. And he wrote about the Boston bombing shortly before he passed away. And the Boston bombing was the same way. I bet if you looked at October 7th, if Dave McGowan was alive today, he would tear October 7th apart, right? So he's a boomer too, right? And he exploded all of these sacred cows that the boomers believe in, these things, you know, that he was the guy who said all the things you couldn't say. He's like Max in a way. You know what I mean? He didn't have Bitcoin, but he was like Max in a way. All these sacred cows that the boomers have, he exploded them one by one, right? Let's get back to the fool for a second, because the name of this show is What a Fool Believes. And I think everyone in Bitcoin is a fool in some way. And what I mean by that is when you start your Bitcoin journey, you're like the fool on the tarot card, right? If you're familiar with the tarot cards, the most, you know, there's a lot of different versions of it, but in the most famous and I think the most, well-known version, the fool is a young man looking up in the sky. He's got a pole over his shoulder with all of his belongings in a bundle. You know, that classic hobo pole, right? He's got a little white dog barking at his feet. He's got a white rose in his hand. He's got the full moon behind him. He's got actually the moon and the sun in the sky. It's card 0, you know, unlimited potential, right? And he's walking off a cliff just with a smile on his face, blindly going off the cliff, right? And there's these really formidable, jagged-looking mountains behind him, right? He is the guy who is this optimist who's starting on this journey, right? Walking off the cliff into the unknown. And that really is what Bitcoiners are doing, right? We're starting this journey innocent, courageous, right? With our loyal dog at our feet, barking to let us know, hey, you're going off a cliff, my friend, but going right with us, right? So the fool is really, in some ways, the archetype of every Bitcoiner at the beginning of their Bitcoin journey, right? And I think Max, he represents that fool archetype, right? At the end of the Bitcoin journey, right? At the end of the tarot, the last card in the major arcana, the fool card is card 0. It's the first card in the major arcana, right? There's actually 22 cards. The last card is numbered 21, and that's the world, right? That's the end of the journey, completion, maturity, you know? That's when, you know, the fool's journey through those 22 steps is complete, right? And that's the end of the journey. Or is it? Because a lot of people, remember, I'm this guy who, the Ouroboros is the symbol that I think represents the world, right? This fool's journey ends with the world. But in the tarot, there is no ending. The tarot is like the Ouroboros because the last card in the tarot, the 22nd card, is also the Fool. That's how we get our infinity symbol in the tarot, right? The first card is the innocent fool, right? Who's starting the journey all the way through completeness and maturity, right? Through fullness, knowledge, wisdom. It's a journey of from innocence to experience and wisdom with all the steps in between. But it also has that implied card number 22, which is the fool again. So this person who is a wise person, but is willing and ready to make the first step on the fool's journey again, right? And I've talked to a few people who are older people, even older than me recently, who are very mature, right? But they're ready to take this first step in the, you know, ready to play the fool again, to take their first step on their Bitcoin journey, right? Study that card, the first card in the tarot, the card 0, the little hobo pole with all the belongings over the shoulder is really telling to me, because I say Bitcoiners are natural minimalists and minimalists are natural Bitcoiners, right? There's a lot of stuff packed in there, my friends. It's worth studying. So the Fool, very important archetype for Bitcoin, right? what else do I want to say about the Fool? Max is the Fool. And I think, but here's another, the Fool has a lot of facets to it. There's a lot of power in the Fool. There's a lot of information packed in there because, I just talked about the Fool, who is like the jester, who can speak truth to the king, right? And can, be this sarcastic character dressed up in motley, right? That's going to hold the king accountable. But there's another saying about the Fool too. The fool and his money are soon parted. I think that's a different take on the Fool, not this holy fool starting their journey with innocence and energy and a willingness to take a chance. This Fool, right, is a different meaning of the word fool. A fool and his money are soon parted. And I think what that means is, or the way I'm understanding it is, the Fool is the first step, right? But you can't be a fool all the way along your journey, right? As you go through your journey, you start as the Fool, but the very next card in the tarot, for example, is the Magician. And the Magician has one hand pointing to the stars and one hand pointing to the ground. As above, so below. The Magician is the alchemist. The Magician has all of the suits of the tarot. It has cups, it has wands, it has swords, and it has pentacles, all there. Those suits represent, the earth, air, fire, water, the elements of the world. So the knowledge of the world is what is the first step on your journey. Once you start as the Fool, then you got to get your shit together. You're the Magician. You have to understand how things work, right? And that's also on the Bitcoiner's journey. Once you start your journey, you have to become or take steps to become a sovereign, to understand how things work. That's where study comes in, right? That's where understanding, how to acquire this asset and then how to hold it. That's where Stay Humble and Stack Sats begins. And I don't know if you know what these four items, these four suits of the tarot represent, right? Cups is empathy, right? One of the immortal attributes that we have as immortals, empathy. Wands is intuition. Another one of the immortal, the attributes of immortals, right? Intuition. So cups, wands, the sword, right? That's reason. That's being able to see things as they are, right? That's first principles thinking, reason. And the last one, pentacles, is valor. The pentacle is tied to courage, right? So these are some of the things, these are the tools that we have on the first step. Once the Fool starts walking down the path, right? This journey that's going to lead to the world and then back to the Fool again. That's the first thing, right? That's how you that's how the Fool who steps off the cliff doesn't get parted from their money, right? That's how the Fool arms himself or herself or himself or herself for this journey, right? So, kind of a rambling rant today, right? Inspired by the not the Pope of Bitcoin, not the clown prince of Bitcoin, though he is called Keiser, right? He is a clown. He is a fool in the best way possible. Max Keiser, this boomer who won't let go of the moon landing of all things, right? You should study the moon landing. Look at Dave McGowan's work into the moon landing. You can find it online, right? It's almost laughable. It's almost like the way, once you start looking into these things that are everyone knows are true, right? These things, right? The Kennedy assassination, 9/11, October 7th, all these things that we're forced to really say are true in a way, right? The media bombards us with it. The veneer is so thin. I saw a really good interview, and this is toward the end of the show, which people don't watch, so I can say whatever I want here, right? Jason Brashears, who you know is my man, from Archaics 138 on YouTube. He was interviewing Flat Earth Dave the other day. And I'm not a flat earther, though I respect him. I'm a simulation guy. There's a lot of overlap and a lot of similarities. But Flat Earth Dave is like Dave McGowan in a way. They're both Daves, right? What a synchronicity that is. And his critique of globe Earth is very compelling when you get into it. Flat Earth is another dearly held belief, round Earth, the universe, this thing is a dearly held belief, for not just boomers, for everyone, right? It goes way, hundreds of years we've been, the society has been programmed to believe that. It took a long time for science to bring the globe Earth and the universal model that we have today into the mainstream, into the consciousness of people. And it's very, very judiciously and fastidiously maintained, right? This is one of the things they want us to believe. But Flat Earth Dave and Jason's conversation is really great. Flat Earth Dave says, people say, why do you spend so much time on Flat Earth? It seems so silly. Why would you spend time on that? And he goes, dude, it's really the basis of everything, the globe Earth story and the speck of dust in the universe story that's been told to us is told to us because it takes us away from the center of the story. You're no longer the protagonist of the story. You're no longer important. Flat Earth puts you right in the center again, right? Once you get into Flat Earth, and I'd recommend if you're new to Archaics and you don't really know Jason's work, one of the good places to start is that interview with Dave. It's really cool. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I remember the first time I heard about Flat Earth, because I've heard about Flat Earth before, obviously, but my nephew got into Flat Earth probably, 2018, 2019, and it was, I don't know if it was he just found it on the internet and he started talking about it, and I think he really was compelled by it. He was super interested in it, but he was a Flat Earth derider, and he would laugh at it. But when he told me about it, I could see a little spark in his eye that he wanted to believe it, right? He wanted to believe it, and probably because when you're on a flat Earth in that paradigm, in that model, you are the center. It isn't like a meaningless black-pilled universe. It's an exciting worldview to have, right? I bet Max is not a flat Earth guy either. You know me. It's more about entertainment and instruction. It's more about that for me than it is about the science. So, flat Earth, moon skepticism, skepticism about all these bullshit psyops. That's what we as Bitcoiners have to go through. Who knows when we're at the end of the journey and we start as the fool again, whether we'll hold these models in our heads for the way the world works. But we can use them to make predictions, and we can see if these predictions come true. And that will either support these models or not, right? But the cool part about being in Bitcoin, once you've started the fool's journey, is you can believe whatever you want, right? You don't have to believe the same things that I believe. I like I go back to I'm a boomer, and one of the books that a lot of my friends read back in the day was the books of Carlos Castaneda, and I'm going to end here because I know I'm ranting now and I'm rambling. And if you're familiar with Carlos Castaneda, he was an anthropologist, right? He was a guy who went and studied, cultural anthropologist, and he studied a Native American, you could say. He was really from Mexico, right? A Sonoran brujo called Don Juan, right? And this whole system of magic and he would take psychedelic mushrooms, and it was a whole system that Carlos Castaneda was investigating. And it was a really popular book, the first one, The Teachings of Don Juan. And then it turned out that Carlos Castaneda was making shit up and it wasn't true, who knows, But one of the things about in those books that he said is Don Juan said to him, is you have to follow the path with heart, right? And that's what the Bitcoin journey is for me too. It's a path with heart. So we're on that path. And this was go back to the episode I did on, it was another Friday. This is a Friday when this episode is being recorded. The one I did about Friday. Thank God it's Friday, right? That's a good one too. That kind of ties in. Fridays are my weird, it's not Simulation Sunday, but it is a little bit of a weird day where I investigate archetypes and I riff on them. So that's it for today. Crazy rambling rant today in this rip. But that's the way I felt today. And it is my Citadel summer and I get to say whatever I want. I will talk to you tomorrow. Thanks for sticking with me so long. Peace.